is obviously laughable in comparison with today's scientific worldview that our planet was formed roughly 4.6 billion years ago, or are simply implausible on rational grounds using critical analysis. For example, how big would the Ark of Noah have needed to be to house all the creature types of the Earth? It would have been so large that the stresses on the wooden beams of its construction could not be sustained. The beams would have snapped and the Ark could not have been built. Therefore, if it was truly built, it was not just a fairy story. It could not have housed all the animal types of the Earth. It must have been much smaller. Religious beliefs are in many respects the deepest level of one's cognitive hierarchy. One goes about one's daily life, doing the usual things one does to earn money, live in a family, socialize, etc. But most people, from time to time, stop to think about deeper things, about the point of it all. Where is my life going? What kind of person should I be, etc. At these deeper levels of thought, people often tend to use religious beliefs as answers. Since these beliefs are fundamental to their lives, they are rarely questioned. They are the foundation stones on which one constructs the superstructure of one's cognitive life. If someone comes along, for example, a cynical, analytical, science-literate critic like myself, who ridicules your deepest beliefs, you will feel very uncomfortable, because if you lose your cognitive base, who are you, and how can you interpret the world? Such a reinterpretation can be very disturbing. When I was an undergraduate university student in the 1960s in Australia, it was pretty much routine to see freshers, that's first-year students, lose their religiosity, as they were bombarded by criticisms of their religious beliefs that they had held during their childhood, which they had inherited from their parents. Only very few students graduated as believers. Nearly all of them became atheists. I can imagine a similar phenomenon occurred at that time in the UK and continental Europe, especially in Paris. However, I doubt this would have happened even today in the US. These freshers were thrown into a state of confusion. Their colleagues were ridiculing them for holding such blind, unquestioned, irrational assumptions. They were forced to reevaluate their deepest beliefs. Also, what they were learning at the university, especially if it was one of the sciences, was teaching them the scientific method, that is, demanding proof for one's hypotheses, going out into the world and looking to check to see if some idea is true or not, questioning and doubting what one is told because it might be rubbish. The science-based students learned that cynicism is good. Since science is spectacularly the best knowledge-generating recipe that humanity has so far, or rather men, have so far devised, it's not surprising that the scientific worldview has dominated our global culture. A century or more ago, religious beliefs were dominant. In the Middle Ages, in Europe, it was utterly dominant. One only has to look at the artwork of the period to see that. Religious ideas utterly controlled the minds of people in those days. Today, we live in a period of transition between religious-based worldviews and science-based worldviews. Some parts of the world are well advanced along this transition. Asian countries, particularly those that are Buddhist-based, were never truly religious in the sense of believing in a super being, a god that created everything, that is concerned with individuals. In the West, it's the more sophisticated old world countries of Europe that have secularized the most, that is, have become the least religious, compared to the New World European colonies. For example, international surveys asking people if God is important in your daily life got a 70% yes result in the US, compared with 10% in Denmark. In other words, in many parts of Europe, religion has effectively died out. God is dead, as Nietzsche said more than a century ago. Ad-libbing, actually it was, Christ. Hegel, and Nietzsche got it from Hegel. But even the US, as far more conservative culture with its religiosity and nationalism, is secularizing. The proportion of religious people is slowly going down. The US is a special case in terms of its religious institutions. As stressed several times in this book, America is a middle-class migrant culture. The European upper class chose not to migrate in the 19th century, so the US grew up with a level of mindlessness that is typical of the middle class. America's middle-class mindlessness is characterized by a disinterest in questioning its religious beliefs and its lack of intellectual criticality. It's therefore not surprising that Europe's upper-class intellectuals tend to treat the US with a certain degree of disdain and condescension, especially French intellectuals. Many of Europe's fringe religious groups and sects fled the cynicism and ridicule of Europe to the New World with its vast open spaces and established small-town communities all over the country. Small towns do not generate many critically minded, well-educated intellectuals, so the small-town communities remain much the way they were when they were founded, that is, holding the middle and lower-class beliefs of their first generation. Much of the US is small town, with little communities all over the continental-sized country. The secularization that is occurring in the US is mainly in the big cities. In modern times, more and more Americans are living in cities and are exposed to a wider range of ideas and lifestyles. A city with its millions of people will have a critical mass of intellectuals, the top 1% of the population in intelligence terms and in terms of the level of book learning. This intellectual critical mass can then exert its intellectual authority and dominance over the middle-class masses, slapping down their middle-class mindlessness, forcing them to question their previously unquestioned beliefs. This process is being aided by the growing economic globalization process. One interesting phenomenon in this regard that is now occurring increasingly in the US is that it's the European intellectual upper class that is hammering American religiosity. The attitude gap now between European and American religiosity levels is so great that European intellectuals are openly sneering at the US, calling it socially backwards, superstitious, having a childlike gullibility. On the religious front, relations between the US and Europe are definitely souring. But the historical trend is clear, as judged by the statistics. The US is secularizing, as most rich industrialized countries, where nearly 50% of young people get a tertiary education and are hence exposed to a higher level of critical thinking and a scientific worldview. What about less developed countries, poorer countries, where a much smaller proportion of the younger people get a tertiary education? What about cultures where religion is really strong, that is, comparable to where the Western cultures were several centuries ago? How will these countries adapt to the creation of a growing global culture? Won't their religious beliefs block their assimilation into that global culture? To be specific, let us take the example of the Arab countries, the Muslims. The Muslims are going through a very tough time at the time of writing. Their greatest enemy, that is, the greatest threat to their religion, way of life, attitudes and beliefs, is westernization, essentially scientification. That is, the process of seeing science-based beliefs undermine traditional religious beliefs. The Arabs are a proud, hot-blooded people who do not like at all what is currently happening to them, which is that their traditional culture is gradually being destroyed by being undermined by the Western and increasingly global scientific viewpoint. Arab intellectuals are becoming more conscious that their Muslim culture is dying and that the global status level of Arabs is near the bottom on the world scale. Western countries judge the Arab countries very harshly and coldly. There are some 24 Arab countries. None of them are modern democracies, according to worldaudit.org/democracy.htm. Speaking ad-libbing, I think there's at least one. Tunisia? I think Tunisia is Arab because it's Northern African. And it's a democracy, more or less. So, anyway. An organization that ranks countries by their level of democratic development. The Arab countries range between about 80 and 150 out of a possible 150 countries, where larger numbers mean less democratic. The Arab countries are rather poor, with a few oil-rich exceptions, largely uneducated, dictatorial and socially backward, with a medieval intolerant belief system that actually hinders their integration into the modern world, into the growing culturally homogeneous global state. Ad-libbing, when I wrote this 10 years ago, I wasn't aware then of the enormous importance of average IQ to the level of economic development of a country. There's a strong correlation. If you can increase just the average IQ by 1 IQ point, it has a significant impact on the GNP, gross national product of a country. A strong correlation. So the Arabs have an average IQ of 85. So that makes them as dumb by white or Asian Eastern Asian standards as American blacks, also 85. In fact, 85 is the average world IQ level. So if you're, say, Europeans or Americans or Russians with an average IQ of about 100, then that makes a significant impact on the level of development of your country. So smarter people can do more. So whole populations of smarter people can do far more than dumb countries. Back to the book. Arab culture emphasizes traditional rote learning, that is, studying the Quran, rather than modern science. Young Arabs are taught to conform to traditional beliefs, rather than to question and criticize. Hence, it's not surprising that Arab cultures do not progress much, and in relative terms are falling further and further behind the Western countries, and more recently, even the Eastern countries. The Chinese, for example, are also poor, dictatorial, but at least they have beliefs that allow radical change. Ad-libbing, plus the fact, similar to a previous ad-lib comment, the Chinese are the smartest large population group in the world. They have an average IQ of 105. So that will have a huge impact on the level of Chinese development in the 21st century. They will catch up to the West, surpass the West, because they're smarter than the West. Average IQ of Westerners is 100. Europeans, Americans, Russians, and so on. So China's a bit of an anomaly. If they're so smart, why are they such a political shithole? Good question. Back to the book. The Chinese want to get rich and are prepared to work for it. The Chinese are energetic and ambitious, and the spectacular rise in their standard of living in the past 30 years shows what can be done. The Arabs, on the other hand, have a bad no-can-do Arab international reputation, meaning that they lack enterprise, that they give up easily when the going gets tough, and generally do not perform well. The Japanese rank them at second bottom on their global scale of respect and admiration. The Japanese have effectively no minorities on their territory to offend, so feel free to discuss openly what they think of other cultures. The Japanese truly admire Western cultures, especially the US, who defeated them so easily in World War II, after the Japanese, the Japs, went fascist in the 1930s. They also admire West European cultures, France, Germany, Britain, which interestingly are the same cultures I chose to discuss in chapters 2 and 3, as being the top few world-class cultures leading the world. The Japanese have been trying to imitate and catch up with the West for the past century and a half. Economically, they have done so, but socially, they are still decades behind the West, as chapters 2 and 3 made clear. The Japanese assessment of the Arabs is interesting because Japan is the only country I know of that has such a public ranking. Other countries are more heterogeneous, especially migrant nations like the US, Canada, Australia, etc., whose populations include Arabs and are hence more inhibited about insulting a minority group. Since the Japanese have no minority groups to speak of to feel insulted, they feel free to insult anyone they like, especially black Africans, whom they place at the bottom of the pile, with the deep suspicion that the blacks are not only culturally backward relative to the rest of the planet, but genetically inferior, with an average IQ significantly lower than other racial groups. Ad-libbing, that's true. There are a billion black Africans with an average IQ, according to dozens of scientific studies, average IQ of 70. The only people dumber than that are the Australian Aborigines, at average IQ of 60. And then the small groups in Africa again, the Bushmen, the Kalahari Bushmen, the Pygmies in Central Africa, average IQ 55. So science says very clearly that blacks are the dumbest people on the planet. I mean, some group has to be, and it's the blacks. Back to the book. The Japanese point to the average IQ scores between blacks and whites in the US, where there's a full standard deviation difference, that's about 15 IQ points, between average black IQs and average white IQs. The Japanese do not like working with the Arabs on the whole, because they feel the Arabs are unreliable, dishonest, thieving, lazy, and unenterprising. The Japanese do not respect Arabs. A similar assessment is also true of Western nations. Westerns on the whole do not respect the Arabs either. The Arabs are becoming increasingly conscious of their low status in the world, and it hurts. It hurts very badly, and they are lashing out. It's difficult for Westerners to know how it feels to have a cultural inferiority complex, as many Arabs feel they have, especially the educated ones. The Western nations have been globally dominant for the past few centuries, so have no first-hand experience of feeling inferior to greatly more advanced nations. The poor ignorant Arabs, that is most of them, are blissfully unaware of their global status, so maintain their Arab pride. But as Western media etc. penetrates the Arab mind more and more, even they are waking up to their humble status. This growing consciousness of Arab inferiority is not the first time this phenomenon has occurred in their history. In the late 6th century AD, the Arabs were considered by the Jews and Christians of the Middle East to be inferior, largely due to the religious differences between the Judeo-Christians and the Arabs. The Jews and Christians had monotheistic, that is, one God, religions. The Arabs were still in the multi-theistic stage, which was seen as primitive and inferior by the Jews and Christians. Along came Muhammad, the Arabs' Jesus Christ, who invented the monotheistic belief system of Islam, with its one God, Allah, and almost overnight pulled the Arabs into the then modern world, that is, equal in status with the Jews and Christians. All three then had their own monotheisms. The effect of this equalization was amazing. Suddenly the Arabs were released from their cultural inferiority complex, which was a greatly liberating, ego-enhancing, energizing, cathartic experience that collectively, that is, when it happened to millions of Arabs, released a torrent of energy and surge of cultural self-confidence and cultural assertion that resulted in the Arabs conquering all of the Middle East, North Africa, and even Spain. They almost got further north beyond Spain, but lost a critical battle in France and pulled back. Arab culture then blossomed in the arts, architecture, science, mathematics, etc. Europe owes its renaissance to the Arabs, who brought classical Greek and Roman learning from the Middle East to the West via Spain. Jewish scholars in Spain translated the Arab texts into Latin, which then spread throughout Europe, stimulating the Renaissance, that is French for rebirth. So a millennium ago, the Europeans were relatively barbarians and the Arabs were at their peak, a greatly superior culture. A millennium later, we see the roles reversed. The Arabs have got stuck in their achievements of the Middle Ages and have not progressed. They have fallen behind again. This time, it's not because their gods are backward, it's because they still have gods. The world's leading nations are now secularizing, with Europe in the lead, pushing towards a more science-based view of the world that corresponds more closely to the way the world is, as evidenced by the overpowering effectiveness of modern technology. The science must be correct to the extent that engineers can build a flying machine that can transport 800 people at a time across a vast ocean in an Airbus A380 ad-libbing. So, for the Arabs, history is repeating itself. Arab culture is once again experiencing an inferiority complex relative to its neighbours, although in this millennium one's neighbours are not hundreds of kilometres away, but thousands. Arab culture needs a new prophet, an Arab Ataturk. Ataturk was the father of modern Turkey, a political leader who lived in the early 20th century, who secularized and modernized Turkey. Someone who can champion the idea that the Arabs should join the modern 21st century world and become a member of the emerging global culture. If this does not happen soon, that is in the next few decades, then the Arab countries will be excluded from the club of advanced globalizing nations, if they haven't been already. The barriers stopping the Arab nations from joining this club are largely religious, although one could search at a deeper socio-economic level to explain why Arab religiosity remains so strong. So as long as countries such as those of the Arabs remain deeply religious, whereas most of the more modern world secularizes, scientizes, then a truly global state will remain out of reach. Of course, Globa will not come into being by having all nation-states deciding to join it at the same moment. The creation of Globa will be an incremental, step-by-step process, a cumulative process that the Arab nations will probably join, but at a much later date, decades later than the leading nations. This lateness will reflect on them poorly because it will show up their cultural, economic and intellectual backwardness. The first nations to merge will be the richest, most democratic, most progressive nations. A similar analysis to the above applies to black Africans, which the Japanese consider absolutely to be the most backward people of the planet. If one looks at the standards of living in the world's countries, looking at black Africa is depressing. Most of the very poorest countries in the world are in black Africa. Europeans typically refer to black Africa as a basket case, that is, hopeless. At living, that's not surprising because there are 1 billion black Africans with average IQ of 70. And there's a strong correlation between the average IQ level of a country and its standard of living. It's GNP, gross national product, per person. You have a very low IQ country, you have millions of low IQ people. People with low IQs cannot perform much, they don't understand much, their performance level is lower, so the whole country's output and standard of living is lower. That makes sense. Some group, some racial group has to be the lowest or the highest, and the lowest are the blacks. That's just a fact of life that the blacks will have to accept, because not to is to live in a fairyland. This is to be an Iscyanate fairy. Iscyanate means ignorant of science, unable to reason scientifically. And fairy is to live in a fairyland, believing what you want to believe without evidence, like believing in the tooth fairy. Back to the book. But in reality, even Africa is starting to move along the route towards the creation of a global state. For example, the black African nations have formed an African Union, AU, somewhat similar to the European Union, which is starting to make political decisions at the post-national level. Some of black Africa's economies are really starting to grow, using the modern free market model that the US and the UK have been pushing since the 1980s, that has so reinvigorated the economies of China and India in recent decades. But the basket case, that is, really hopeless countries in the world, are mostly in sub-Saharan Africa, in other words, black Africa, the poorest continent, a subcontinent that barely invented its own writing systems, the bottom of the pile. Some region of the earth, by definition, has to be at the bottom. Africa has its own gods, of course, as do all peoples on the planet. These traditional religions are not monotheisms on the whole. Monotheism would have been too sophisticated a concept for small tribal communities that have been mostly hunter-gatherers for most of their history. Africa too will have to modernize its cultures to join the global culture. It too will need to scientize, get richer, get better educated, become cosmopolitan, multify, etc., just as will the Arabs and many other countries in similar situations. So we can now try to come to some conclusions about the problems that the creation of a culturally homogeneous global state will face when confronted by differences in religions. Religious differences create powerfully divisive forces between communities for the reasons suggested above. Hence it seems fairly obvious that to create a homogeneous global culture, religions will need to be homogenized, or more accurately, completely eliminated. It's the latter option that seems to me to be the most likely. The world has a new religion, in a manner of speaking, namely science. Science is a belief system that is sweeping the world. It explains the way the world works far more effectively than any other system, due to its insistence on testing its hypotheses. Science has generated a formidable applied spin-off, namely technology, that has increased the welfare, the standard of living, the quality of material life of billions of people. Nearly everyone in the rich countries appreciates having cars, electric blankets, stereos, televisions, telephones, central heating, penicillin, the internet, etc. The whole planet wants to get richer in the material sense, so this is a social political force that will run to saturation. That is, it will conquer the whole earth. This process is now so well underway that to most thinkers it's not even controversial. The planet will globalize economically, in the sense that nearly everyone will want to be rich and have all these wonderful gadgets and services. The only bottlenecks in this regard are such issues as climate change, running out of oil, etc. Ultimately, there are enough raw materials in the asteroids and enough hydrogen in the gas giant planets to supply humanity with raw materials and nuclear fusion-based energy for millions of years, so the longer-term prospects look rosy. Humanity only has to get over the immediate hump of this century to create a state of global richness. It's coming. So how likely is it that the planet will scientize? Europe is well along this route. Religious beliefs are looked upon as superstitions by most Europeans now. This is not the case in the US, but the same secularization process is occurring there too, but decades behind Europe. Other advanced Western nations like Canada, Australia, New Zealand, etc. are in positions similar to Europe. Many of the Asian nations were not very into theisms in the first place, with Buddhism being more of a lifestyle and philosophy than a religion. So secularization in Asian countries should be less problematic than, say, in the Arab countries. As the world gets richer, I think it's reasonable to say that people will become better educated, think more critically, more skeptically, more scientifically, and reject their old religions as superstitions and embrace science as the global religion, in quotes. Once the Earth's people see the world in the same way, that is through scientific eyes, it will be much easier to culturally unify them, because they will not be divided by religious differences. There can be no religious differences when there are no more religions to differ between. The world's cultures will be unified by a common view of the world, that is, one based on the scientific method of not believing anything if there's no good reason or experimental proof that it's true or likely to be true. Blind faith of, "I believe in it because I want to believe in it," will not be seen as being serious. A more intellectually critical world will be less tolerant of people thinking in such a way. Of course, religious beliefs will continue, but religionists will probably become a minority group and should be allowed to live in their ignorance. But probably due to their small numbers, if the experience of European secularization becomes a model for the whole planet, they will not have much impact in blocking the creation of a culturally, that is, religiously, homogenized global culture. Secularization and scientification are global phenomena. There's no reason to see why these processes will not continue. As the world media provides a higher quality and availability of science education programs, billions of people can become educated into the basic principles of science and then lose their superstitions. Religion as a divisive force will then lose its sting and quietly die away, the way the witch craze died or the slave trade died. But what about the sense of meaninglessness that science can generate? Won't there be a strong case to be made that scientific knowledge makes human existence seem pointless, meaningless, minuscule in a universe that is so hugely larger and older than we are, both individually and as a human species? Our universe is billions of years old, whereas our pathetic human lives are snuffed out in a mere 80 years? Won't the global rise of science only alienate more people and hence foster the need all the more strongly for religion to fill the void? Experience shows that a good knowledge of science need not make one feel insignificant in the universe. In fact, it can generate a sense of belonging, because in a very real sense, human beings and any matter on the planets is star stuff. That is, consisting of atoms that were cooked up in exploding massive stars called supernova and blown out for next generation stars to accumulate as flotsam, as dross, called planets. The vista of deep space, the billions of years of evolution, the complexity of living creatures, and the human brain create a sense of awe among scientifically minded people. It's a kind of religion, but one based on scientific knowledge, not religious or tribal myth. Also, a good scientific education and familiarity with the use of logic and critical reasoning makes the very concepts of many religions untenable, incredible in the literal sense of the word, even gullible. For example, take the Christian belief in a loving God. That is, not only a God that created everything, but who, listens to what individual human beings say to him, The simple fact that last century about 300 million people were killed for political reasons, wars, purges, genocides, holocausts, etc., makes the idea of a loving God who let 300 million people be obliterated seem stupid. As people get better educated, more critically minded, less gullible, it's likely a social pressure will grow against those who are slower moving along this line of progression. In cultures with an old world upper class intellectual tradition and with large enough populations to create an intellectual critical mass, that is, a whole self-supporting culture of intellectuals, for example, UK, France, Germany, then those intellectual leaders will be able to browbeat the peasants, that is, to slap down middle-class mindlessness. For example, as I mentioned briefly in Chapter 2, during the early 1970s, on my first evening in London, as a freshly emigrated young man at 23 from Australia, I was amazed to hear an interview on the BBC TV of a British cabinet minister, that's a leading politician, by a BBC journalist who said to him, "Minister, do you feel embarrassed by your cabinet colleagues when they ridicule you for being religious?" This was over 35 years ago, showing how far and how early the UK has secularised. Similar stories could be told of the Scandinavian countries. America, on the other hand, is still in the phase of having its presidents consulting a higher power prior to going to war. Obviously, the secularisation process will take time. H. Charity begins at home. The aphorism, charity begins at home,